And the first speaker for today is Richard Alwin Fidler from South Africa, professional astrologer and teacher, ex-chairperson of the Cape Town-based Cape Astrology Association, and his lecture topic is Planetary, Dignity and the Zodiac Debate. So let's welcome Richard Alwin Fidler.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be speaking today about a topic that has come up several times during this conference. It's about the tropical sidereal zodiac issue. And my lecture is titled Planetary Dignity and the Zodiac Debate. And before beginning with the actual lecture, I'd like to say a few words about what brought me to this place or this point where I would, as a Westerner, be favoring the sidereal zodiac. You know, for the first 10 years or so of my own astrological journey, I was studying Western astrology, like other Western astrologers tend to do, and using the tropical zodiac. And I felt that it was working, perfectly well. But when I, in 1997, started dipping my toe into Jyotish, the first thing you have to confront there is the fact that there's a different zodiac. And, in your own chart, for example, you have to review everything you thought you knew. So I know that it's a very challenging thing, no matter which side you come from, to suddenly see the same system of astrology with new settings. And for some years, I actually didn't trust either zodiac, tropical or sidereal. But over time, I've eventually come to favor the sidereal zodiac. Now, I know that for many of you in the audience here, you're mostly Indian astrologers using the sidereal zodiac. I wish some of more of my own Western colleagues were here, because they are probably the ones who need to hear this even more, because this is not news to you, really. But in this presentation, I'm going to be comparing the results you get using the two different zodiacs, looking at some important, well-known, famous charts. All right, so very, very briefly, the zodiac used in Western astrology, the tropical zodiac, is anchored by the position of the sun at the equinox and solstices, okay? Whereas in Vedic astrology, the zodiac is based on star positions. And, this debate, when people discuss this, when astrologers debate this issue, they often tend to refer back to old, what old authorities and what old authorities have said about this. It's very rare that this issue is tackled through actual comparison and testing. And this is what I'm suggesting is needed. Now, the star speaker, which many of you might know as Chitra, is that which anchors the sidereal zodiac. Okay, so the sidereal zodiac begins exactly 180 degrees from the speaker. But something I discovered recently, which is really fascinating, is that the four royal stars of ancient Persian astrology, Aldebaran, Antares, Regulus, and Fomalhaut, particularly Antares and Aldebaran, are located at precisely 15 degrees of Taurus and Scorpio. And that also looks very suspiciously or conspicuously like stars that were used to anchor the position of the sidereal zodiac. Now, Robert Hand is a highly regarded authority in the West, and he wrote an article titled "On the Invariance of the Tropical Zodiac," and it was an article that explored this zodiac issue in quite a lot of technical detail. And what you see up there was his final concluding remarks. He said, "I believe we have to regard the tropical sidereal controversy as yet another example of a historical pseudo-problem created by anachronistically projecting a modern problem with modern points of view back onto the ancients. It was not a problem with which they were seriously concerned, given the limits of their computational accuracy. Both systems would have given them the same results. This is a question we have to resolve for ourselves. An appeal to history will not work. Because you see, about 2,000 years ago, there was no difference between the two. And it wasn't a real problem that the ancients had to contend with. We cannot solve this by referring back to ancient authority. Now, as I said, the title of this talk is Planetary Dignity and the Zodiac Debate, because Western and Vedic astrology consider the signs to be ruled by the same planets. It is also believed that the planets are exalted in and fallen in exactly the same signs. And that's just one of many indications that we're essentially here looking at the very same system. But what it also means is that these systems are directly comparable. So essentially we're using the same rules for judging when a planet is strong or weak, but because of the difference in the location of the zodiacs, we get some very different results when we look at actual charts. Now, before we start looking at charts, there's a principle of Vedic astrology that would be very familiar to most of you here, but not so familiar to Western astrologers. It's called the Pancha Maha Purusha Yogas, which roughly translates as the 5 combinations that make a great being. And this occurs, these yogas are formed when planets, the 5 planets, visible planets excluding the sun and moon, are located in their own or exaltation signs while also being in an angular house. So that when a Mahapurusha Yoga is formed, it means that that planet is operating at something close to maximum strength. Okay, and when you use these 2 different zodiacs, you will find that you get very different results. And when these special combinations are formed in the sidereal zodiac, for example, they are more often than not present in the tropical zodiac. But what's also important to note is that this Vedic principle of the Mahapurusha Yogas doesn't offend anything in the basic principles of Western astrology. It could just as well have been a Western astrological principle. But it gives us a means of testing, is what I'm essentially saying. So Adolf Hitler, this chart has been studied many times, and some of my astrology colleagues sometimes roll their eyes and say, not Hitler again, But this is a really important chart because Hitler had a huge impact on history. The Second World War that he was so almost singularly responsible for creating has really shaped modern society in a huge way. And he's one of those individuals who had some sort of great strength and power that enabled him to have such a huge influence. Now, with all of these charts here, on the left-hand side, you have the Western tropical chart. And on the right-hand side, you have basically the Vedic chart using a Western wheel. Now, what you see in the tropical chart, you see that he has Sun and Mars in Taurus. Now, Mars, in Western astrology, Mars is considered to be in its detriment in Taurus. It actually indicates a particularly weak Mars, right? But when we look at it through the lens of the sidereal zodiac, suddenly the Sun and Mars are both very strong. And the Sun and Mars are the planets we would expect. The Sun and Mars are the planets that we would expect to find strong in the chart of somebody who's a military person, a person with a great strength of will, a leader with a very forceful character. Okay, whereas, a Western astrologer looking at this chart, let's say at Hitler's birth, would have struggled to come up with an interpretation that would have predicted that Hitler would have the type of character and the type of influence that he would have had. Now you can see there on the left, the Sun and Mars positions are circled in the sidereal zodiac. Now what you have on the right there is a quote from an ancient Vedic text giving an interpretation of the consequence of having such a strong Mars, when Mars is in its own sign and in an angular house. It's called Rishaka Yoga. And it says, the person born in Rishaka Yoga will have a long face, will acquire wealth by doing many daring deeds, will be brave, will overcome his enemies, will be powerful and arrogant. That's very important, will be powerful and arrogant. He'll be renowned for his merits and will be the leader of an army and will emerge victorious in all his attempts. I mean, that's actually quite literal. And, Vedic astrology would just, due to using the sidereal zodiac, instantly come to the right conclusion and see that Mars is the dominant planet in this chart. Whereas, again, in the tropical chart, Mars actually becomes very weak, and you don't get a very powerful, clear interpretation. Now, the interesting thing is that Hitler and Gandhi have certain things in common in their charts. They both have their ascendants in a very similar part of Libra. And in fact, their ascendants occupy the sign Libra, whichever zodiac you use. And the sign Libra is a very strong sign. It's a cardinal sign and a masculine sign. In the West, people often think of Libra as a little bit wishy-washy because it's ruled by Venus. But many leaders have Libra rising. But take a look. In Gandhi's chart, Venus, both Hitler and Gandhi had a Venus-Mars conjunction, and I guess you could say they were both passionate people. But it's interesting when we look at this chart, compare these charts, that Hitler ends up being the person who has the super strong Mars, and Gandhi ends up having this more peace-loving Venus rising. But as you can see, Gandhi also had Mars opposite Jupiter and Pluto, right? So he certainly wasn't weak or timid, and that particular aspect did give him a great sense of justice. That had a lot to do with his life story. But beyond that, another important thing, because in Gandhi's sidereal chart, Venus is the lord of the first in the first, and the moon is the lord of the 10th in the 10th, those two very important houses, the first and the 10th, become super powerful. And on that basis alone, an astrologer looking at his chart at his birth could have told you that this person was going to become famous, become somebody of note. When the Lord of the 10th is in the 10th, it often means that you're going to rise way above your birth station. And that is not a consequence you get from or interpretation you can get from the tropical chart. Now, Muhammad Ali. In fact, Muhammad Ali's chart is one of those that have made it really difficult for me to relate to the tropical zodiac when it comes to planetary dignity, okay? Because almost like Hitler, you end up there in the tropical chart having Mars in Taurus, Mars in the weakest possible sign. In the sidereal chart, Mars is in Aries and in the 10th house. So like Hitler, he ends up having Rishaka Yoga. Remember what it said? It said, this person will be powerful and arrogant. Muhammad Ali was fond of saying that he was the greatest, and you can see that having Mars as Lord of the 10th in the 10th also means that the 10th house becomes very powerful, so he would rise way above his birth station. You would never see that in the tropical chart. There's another thing. It is well known that Muhammad Ali developed Parkinson's eventually, probably due to the amount of times his head got pounded in all those boxing matches. It is also only in the sidereal chart that the sign Aries, which represents the head and brain, contains two malefics. And in fact, his Parkinson's developed around about the time that his Saturn Dasha began. Now, Condoleezza Rice is a very interesting person. She was Secretary of State under George W. Bush and also became his chief security advisor. And somebody in America, a black woman reaching that high office is quite unusual. A person able to do that would need extraordinary merit. There would be many of these social prejudices that would stand in her way. But clearly she was such a strong person that she was able to rise to that level. And it becomes clear when you compare, when you look at a chart through the sidereal lens. You see, Condoleezza Rice has 4 out of the 5 possible Maha-Purusha yogas. In her sidereal chart, Mars is exalted in Capricorn in the 1st house. Venus is in Libra in the 10th house. Saturn, is the ascendant lord, is exalted in the 10th house. Jupiter is exalted in the 7th house. So there's several planets that are angular and in their signs of maximum strength. And you don't see this in the tropical chart. In the tropical chart, Mars is in Aquarius, where it doesn't get that kind of strength. Saturn, likewise in Scorpio, is not nearly as powerful. So, this is an example of how the sidereal chart often helps you to see instantly that a person is going to rise to some sort of greatness. Looking at a chart through the sidereal lens, you could have made this prediction at her birth, not retrospectively trying to find out why she was great. You could have, even if she was born in humble circumstances, you would see that this person is going places. J.P. Morgan, in his day, he was one of the wealthiest people in the world. And due to his wealth and influence, he was able to force the President of America to negotiate with him on his terms, in exchange for helping bail out America from economic problems. Now, in both the sidereal and tropical charts, the sun is exalted in Aries. And the meaning is clear. He's a person of strong character, a natural leader. But in his sidereal chart, you see that suddenly, again, there's a multiplicity of exalted planets. He ends up having his ascendant Lord Saturn exalted in Libra in the 9th house. Venus, the dispositor, is exalted in the 2nd house. Jupiter, the dispositor, is exalted in the 6th house. So this also again made it clear that this person, would have the best of everything. But his Mars ends up debilitated in the sign Cancer. And what's really interesting is that soon after he began his Mars Dasha, note that the dispositor of Mars, which is the moon, is in the 7th house. Soon after he began his Mars Dasha, he met a woman, fell in love, and married her, but she died a year later from tuberculosis. Now, I'm going to show you a few examples of Mars in Cancer being a placement that often causes tragic, wanton loss of life. Nicholas Culpeper, he was a famous astrologer herbalist in England, and his chart has a very similar pattern to feature to J.P. Morgan, which we'll see in a second. But before we go into that, it's interesting to see that Jupiter's in Sagittarius in both systems, but in the Vedic system, because the ascendant also ends up being in Sagittarius, that Jupiter goes into the 1st house, and this is why he would be such a famous and respected doctor. However, as with J.P. Morgan, he has Mars in the sign Cancer with the dispositor, the moon, in the 7th house. So the story goes that he fell in love with a beautiful heiress. They planned to elope, and on the night of their rendezvous, there was a severe thunderstorm, and while driving to their meeting place, his lover's coach was struck by lightning, and she died instantly. So these tragic deaths one sees again and again with Mars in the sign Cancer. Now, it's a very interesting thing that there are these 2 suicide cult leaders who were born 5 days from each other in 1931, okay? And they went about their business totally separately. They didn't influence or inspire each other in any way, but they happened to be born within a week of each other. Jim Jones and Marshall Applewhite. Now, when you compare the tropical and sidereal charts, you can see that once again Mars ends up in Cancer in the sidereal chart, okay? These are people who convinced others to kill themselves in mass. Again, this theme of tragic and wanton loss of life. But going back one step, note that in the sidereal chart, Jim Jones has got Sagittarius rising. Marshall Applewhite ends up having Pisces rising in the sidereal chart. So they both had Jupiter-ruled descendants. And it seems that this is indicative of, excuse me, the fact that it was in this religious context, in the creation of this religious cult that they expressed themselves. But another interesting thing to note is that both of them have in their tropical charts an exalted Jupiter, which becomes Jupiter in Gemini in the sidereal chart. In other words, that Jupiter in Cancer, which would be a symbol of compassion in the tropical chart, ends up being a detriment to Jupiter in the sidereal chart. Excuse me. Now, we touched on the Mahapurusha yogas earlier. And this is an aphorism giving an interpretation for the results of having Venus forming a Mahapurusha yoga. And you'll see it says the person born in Malavya yoga will have strong limbs, will be resolute, wealthy, endowed with wife, children, and good fortune. You'll be prosperous, will eat good food, enjoy pleasures, and command good vehicles. Excuse me. Now, I underlined that command good vehicles bit there because I remember when I first read this, I thought that's a very strange statement. How do you get that? Well, you see, in Vedic astrology, Venus is what is called a Bhava Karaka, a house significator for the fourth house, which is associated with vehicles. So obviously, if your Venus is very strong, your capacity to have good vehicles would be strong. And I watched this principle over the years, and I noticed that it tends to happen consistently. Then when people have a strong Venus like this, they have good cars. When they go into Venus periods, they often acquire a new car. And on this basis, I once made a prediction to a person I just met who arrived for the consultation on his bicycle. There was nothing about him that seemed exceptional. He was just a plain guy. But he was entering his Venus Dasha. But this is his Western chart, and you can see that Venus is there in the 10th house in the sign Aries, where it would be in his detriment. Whereas in the Vedic chart, his Venus is exalted in Pisces, and he had just entered his Venus Mahadasha. So I said to him, it says here that you will have good vehicles. You might always have had good vehicles, but the vehicles that you will now have will be particularly good. And I said, I know it's a silly little thing, but there's something awakening in you now that corresponds to high-quality cars. And I asked him, have you got a new car in the past year? And he said, yeah, I got it right now. I ordered it a year ago. I asked him, what is it? And he said, it's a Porsche, whatever it is. Now, when you wait for a year for a Porsche, it's the best type of Porsche. Now, this is not an exceptional case. This often happens. But the reason I'm seizing on this example is because I realized that this is a very specific prediction to make for a person. Not like you'll get some sort of luxury thing. No, you'll get specifically a car. You'll get it at this time, and it will be the highest quality car. And this is completely based on the fact that Venus is exalted there, which indicates the high quality, the high caliber manifestation you can expect. Again, in the tropical chart, that Venus is in its detriment. Okay, Bill Clinton. We all know that despite being quite a popular president, he somewhat ruined his reputation through his affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky. Now, you can see, when you compare the tropical and sidereal charts, that in the sidereal picture, Venus is in the sign Virgo. Now, one would think that Venus being in the sign Virgo would mean prudence or chastity, or some difficulty or obstruction with love and sexuality. But in my experience, Venus in Virgo often manifests through the sidereal, through looking at it sidereally, manifests as sexual extremes or excess. So it also being in his first house then had the effect of damaging his reputation. Now, here's another example of the same thing. Chuck Berry. In his sidereal chart, he has Venus in Virgo in the 12th house in mutual reception to Mercury in Libra in the first. Now, when he was in the Venus sub-period of the Mercury major period, which activated that mutual reception, he spent 22 months in jail for taking a teenage prostitute across state lines. And there you have, again, this Venus in Virgo. And by the way, like with Bill Clinton, Venus in Virgo is, translates easily as love of the servant. Having romance with somebody that's kind of your servant or your employee. This is a piece of a chart of somebody I did a consultation for on Skype years ago, who I knew nothing about. I didn't even see her. It was just a voice call. And because of having seen again and again how Venus debilitated in Virgo manifests as sexual excess, I said to her, there might be a little strand of this in your life. At certain periods of your life, there could be some sexual excess, but especially around the age of 24, 25, which is when Venus matures, this could happen. Well, then she told me that when she was a prostitute for that year and that year only. Vincent van Gogh, one of the most celebrated artists of all time. It's interesting to see that Venus and Jupiter end up being in very well placed, Venus exalted, Jupiter in its own sign, whichever system you use. And that makes sense. There was a refinement in his soul and all of that, and he was a very idealistic person. But one would wonder where all the angst came from, where all of his extremism and self-destruction came from. In the sidereal chart, suddenly that Sagittarius moon goes back into Scorpio. And you also end up having Saturn in Aries in the 11th house. Now, in Vedic astrology, the 11th house is very important when it comes to money and finances and earning. So that debilitated Saturn in his 11th house is exactly why he could never make any money for himself. Saturn in Aries is often self-thwarting, struggles to really own their power and take, proper initiative. Now, Nikola Tesla, I'm sure you've all heard of him. He was an engineering genius. Without him, we might not have had electricity as we know it today. Now, when you look at his when you compare his tropical and sidereal charts, it's interesting to see that the Western tropical chart gives him a Taurus ascendant. And if you had to then from there look at his Venus, right, as his ascendant lord, it ends up being in Cancer on the IC. So you would immediately, as a tropical astrologer, have been talking about him being a person who likes stability, likes the familiar, likes to make a nice home, likes to be nurturing and all of that stuff. When you look at the sidereal chart, Aries is rising. Mars, the first house ruler, is in Virgo in the 6th house, not Libra. Right? He never married. Okay? So, and not only that, an entire stellium of planets in Cancer suddenly moved to Gemini. And he was clearly far more mercurial than he was lunar and nurturing and all of that. And in my opinion, here, this is for me an example of where the sidereal chart would have helped you straight away to see where the emphasis really should be placed. You would have been able to predict, rather than having to figure it out retrospectively, what his key attributes were. So, in conclusion, although I favor the sidereal zodiac for assessing planetary strength through sign placement, I do believe that the tropical zodiac is a real thing. And whenever I've been forced to take notice of a tropical zodiac placement, it's tended to be in the context of a mundane event. And for example, the fact that it was the very day that Uranus entered tropical Aries that the Fukushima disaster occurred, right? And other comparable observations of seeing what happens when planets cross the 0 degrees of the cardinal signs has, led ultimately to me believing that the tropical zodiac should really be called solar houses. And that doesn't diminish the value and the significance of the tropical zodiac, but I feel gives it a clearer and maybe more appropriate context. So I'm essentially saying that the relationship between the sidereal and the tropical zodiacs is very similar to the relationship between signs and houses, with the tropical zodiac being the houses and the sidereal signs being the actual zodiac. Thank you very much.